Welcome, friend, to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight, we venture into the frost-laden wilderness of the far north, where ancient peoples lived lives so intertwined with mystery and the natural world that even the most feared warriors of their age would hesitate before crossing their paths. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten stories that history often overlooks, you might consider becoming part of our community of curious listeners. A gentle tap on the subscribe button helps ensure these tales continue to find their way to you. And perhaps if the spirit moves you, a like on this video tells us that these whispered histories bring you the same quiet satisfaction they bring us. Settle yourself comfortably now and allow your mind to drift northward beyond the familiar boundaries of medieval Europe, into lands where the aurora dances across endless winter nights, and the boundary between the seen and unseen grows thin as morning mist. Here, in these remote reaches, lived peoples whose very presence could send ripples of unease through the hearts of Vikings, those same Norse warriors who had struck terror into monasteries from Ireland to Constantinople. Tonight, we explore not conquest through sword and fire, but a different kind of power entirely. A power rooted in deep knowledge of the land, in rituals that seem to bend the very elements to one's will, and in a connection to the spirit world that outsiders could neither understand nor dismiss. This is the story of how a forgotten tribe wielded fear itself as their greatest weapon, turning the natural world into an ally that even the fiercest raiders dared not challenge. Let us begin by stepping into their world, feeling the crunch of snow beneath our feet and the bite of wind that carries with it the whispers of ancient wisdom. Imagine yourself waking not to the gentle warmth of morning sun filtering through familiar windows, but to the pale, ethereal light that filters through the smoke hole of a dwelling built from the very bones of the earth itself. The air carries the sharp clarity of northern wilderness glean, thin and touched with the scent of pine resin and wood smoke. Outside, the world stretches in an endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of ancient spruces that stand like sentinels against the dawn sky. This is the world of the Sami, the indigenous peoples of the far north, whose lives unfolded in harmony with rhythms older than memory. In the medieval period, when Vikings sailed their longships across treacherous seas to raid distant shores, the Sami followed different currents entirely: the seasonal migrations of reindeer herds, the subtle changes in wind direction that spoke of coming storms, and the invisible pathways that spirits were said to travel between worlds. The morning begins, as it has for countless generations, with the careful tending of fires that must never be allowed to die completely. In the bone-deep cold of the northern winter, fire represents far more than mere warmth. It is life itself, the difference between survival and surrender to the relentless embrace of frost. The flames dance in patterns that the elders read like ancient texts, their flickering telling stories of the day ahead, of weather brewing beyond the horizon, of movements in the spirit world that might affect the physical realm. Picture yourself wrapped in garments that speak of deep understanding of this harsh environment. Your clothing is not merely functional, but carries within its construction centuries of accumulated wisdom. The outer layer consists of a tunic and trousers crafted from reindeer hide, the fur turned inward to trap precious body heat, while the smooth outer surface sheds wind and moisture. Over this, a coat that the Sami call a gokti, beautifully decorated with bands of red, blue, and yellow, colors that seem to glow against the monochrome landscape of small suns captured in fabric. But it is not just the clothing that marks you as belonging to this northern world. Your boots, sewn from reindeer skin and stuffed with dried grass for insulation, allow you to move silently across snow that would betray the presence of outsiders with every step. Around your neck hangs an amulet carved from reindeer antler, not mere decoration, but a protective charm imbued with power through ritual and belief, connecting you to the unseen forces that govern life in this austere realm. The rhythm of daily life flows according to patterns set not by human ambition, but by the great migrations and seasonal cycles that have governed the north since time immemorial. During the long months when darkness reigns supreme and the sun barely brushes the horizon before retreating again. Life centers around the warmth of the dwelling and the careful conservation of resources gathered during the brief, intense summer. Imagine the sounds that punctuate this existence: the soft whisper of wind across endless snowfields, the distant crack of ice adjusting to temperature changes, the occasional call of a raven, that clever bird that has learned to follow human habitation because it understands that people mean survival opportunities. But cutting through these natural sounds comes something that would make an outsider's blood run cold: the deep, rhythmic beating of a drum made from reindeer hide stretched over a wooden frame, its surface painted with symbols that map the boundaries between worlds. This is the sound that accompanies the practice that would, perhaps more than anything else, cement the Sami's reputation among their neighbors as wielders of supernatural forces. The drum, or runnibum, serves as far more than a musical instrument. In the hands of a Noadia Sami shaman, it becomes a vessel for traveling between the physical and spirit worlds, a tool for divination, and a means of calling upon forces that outsiders can neither see nor comprehend. The daily preparation of food reflects this same integration of practical necessity with spiritual understanding. Reindeer meat, preserved through smoking and drying, provides the protein essential for survival in this calorie-demanding environment. But the preparation involves rituals of gratitude and respect for the animal that gave its life, acknowledgements of the spirits that govern the hunt, and careful attention to ensuring that nothing is wasted. For waste in this environment is not merely impractical, but a form of spiritual transgression. Fish pulled from holes cut through thick ice are treated with similar reverence. The long, patient hours spent beside these fishing holes waiting in temperatures that would kill the unprepared become opportunities for meditation, for listening to the subtle communications that flow between the human and natural worlds. The Sami understood that successful fishing depended not merely on technique, but on maintaining proper relationships with the spirits of the water, beings whose favor could mean the difference between a full belly and starvation. During the summer months, when the sun never sets and the landscape transforms from white austerity to a brief explosion of green life, the rhythm changes, but the underlying spiritual framework remains constant. This is the season of following the reindeer herds as they migrate to summer feeding grounds, of gathering berries and medicinal plants, of trading with neighboring peoples, interactions that often reinforce the Sami's reputation as wielders of mysterious powers. The dwellings themselves reflect this unique worldview. The traditional Sami tent, or lavu, consists of wooden poles arranged in a circular pattern and covered with reindeer hide. But the circular shape is not merely practical, it mirrors the Sami understanding of the cosmos itself as circular, with no true beginning or end, and with the sacred fire at the center serving as a connection point between the earthly realm and the world of spirits. Within these dwellings, children grow up surrounded by stories that blur the line between history and magic, between the practical knowledge necessary for survival and the spiritual wisdom that governs all existence. They learn to read the subtle signs that indicate changes in weather, the tracks that tell the story of animals' movements through the forest, and the dreams that sometimes carry messages from the spirit world. Perhaps most unsettling to outsiders would be the casual way in which the supernatural intersects with daily life in Sami culture. A child might mention seeing a huldra, a forest spirit, while gathering firewood, and rather than being dismissed as imagination, such reports would be carefully considered and appropriate protective measures taken. Adults speak matter-of-factly about consulting the spirits before making important decisions, about receiving warnings in dreams, and about the necessity of maintaining proper relationships with the invisible inhabitants of the landscape. This integration of spiritual practice with survival necessity creates an atmosphere that outsiders often find deeply unsettling. To the Sami, the distinction between natural and supernatural is largely meaningless. All forces, whether visible or invisible, are part of the same interconnected web of existence that must be navigated with wisdom, respect, and appropriate ritual observance. As winter deepens and the aurora borealis begins its nightly dance across the star-filled sky, the Sami gather for ceremonies that have been performed in these lands for thousands of years. The drums beat in rhythms that seem to match the pulse of the earth itself, and voices join in chants that call upon ancient spirits for protection, for guidance, and for the strength to endure until spring returns to the land. It is during these long winter nights, when the boundary between worlds grows thin and the spirits are said to move most freely, that the Sami's reputation for supernatural power takes on its most concrete form. For it is then that the Noadi enters into trance states, traveling in spirit to distant realms to gather information, to intercede with powerful beings on behalf of the community, and to wield forces that exist beyond the understanding of those who have not spent lifetimes learning to navigate the invisible currents that flow through the northern wilderness. This, then, is the world that awaited any outsider bold enough or foolish enough to venture into Sami territory, a realm where every tree, every stone, every shift in the wind carries potential spiritual significance, where the people move through their daily lives in constant communication with forces unseen, and where survival itself depends upon maintaining proper relationships with powers that can neither be conquered by sword nor subdued by conventional warfare. For a people like the Vikings, whose worldview was built upon the understanding that strength of arm and boldness of spirit could overcome any obstacle, encountering a culture that wielded different forms of power entirely presented a challenge unlike any they had faced in their raids across Europe. Here, in the frozen north, conventional weapons meant little against adversaries who were said to command the very elements themselves. The year was somewhere in the late 9th or early 10th century. An otter of Hellegallen stood at the prow of his sturdy vessel, watching the coastline of what we now call northern Norway unfold before him, a manuscript written in ice and stone. Otter was no ordinary Viking. He was a chieftain, a trader, and an explorer whose journeys would eventually carry him as far as the court of King Alfred the Great in England. But on this particular voyage, as he sailed further north than perhaps any Norse explorer before him, he was about to encounter something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about power and fear. The waters here were different from those familiar to most Viking navigators. These were the seas that bordered the land of the Finners, the Norse term for the Sami people, derived from their word Finna, which carried connotations not merely of foreign origin, but of otherworldly capability. As Otter's ship rounded a particular headland, the crew fell unusually quiet, their usual boisterous confidence replaced by something approaching reverence, or perhaps apprehension. What they encountered in these northern waters would later be recorded in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, where Otter's account found its way into written history through the careful transcription of King Alfred's scribes. But the dry, factual tone of those records cannot fully capture the profound unease that seems to have accompanied these first meaningful contacts between the seafaring Norse and the indigenous peoples of the far north. Picture, if you will, that initial moment of contact. Otter's crew, hardened men who had faced Saxon shields and Frankish cavalry without flinching, suddenly found themselves in the presence of people who seemed to move through their harsh environment with supernatural ease. The Sami appeared at the shoreline with the clash of weapons or the shouts of challenge that Vikings had come to expect from potential adversaries, but with a silence that somehow felt more ominous than any battle cry. These northern people wore garments that seemed to blend seamlessly with the landscape itself. Reindeer hide dyed in colors that caught the eye like brief flashes of otherworldly fire against the muted tones of tundra and stone. But it was not their appearance alone that unsettled the Norse visitors. It was the way they seemed to regard the newcomers, not with the fear or aggression that usually greeted Viking longships, but with a kind of knowing assessment, as if they were measuring the Norse against standards utterly foreign to conventional warfare. From the saga literature that would emerge in later centuries, we can piece together fragments of these early encounters. The Heimskringla, that great collection of Norwegian king's sagas compiled by Snorri Sturluson, contains references to the Finna that reveal the complex mixture of fear, respect, and desire for their services that characterized Norse attitudes toward the Sami. These were not people to be conquered in the conventional sense they were. Instead, beings whose cooperation might be sought for purposes that lay far outside the normal realm of diplomatic or military engagement. Consider the story preserved in the saga of Eric the Red, where we read of Thorhall the Hunter, described as a large, dark man who had spent years among the Sami. Thorhall is portrayed as someone who had learned their ways, who could speak their language, and who carried with him something of their reputation for wielding unnatural powers. When the Norse expedition to Vinland faced starvation, it was Thorhall who went apart from the others and, according to the saga, performed some kind of ritual that resulted in the appearance of a whale upon the shore, sustenance that saved the expedition, but came at a spiritual cost that troubled the Christian Norse. But perhaps the most telling encounters are those recorded in the various sagas that deal with the practice of cider, a form of Norse magic that was deeply associated with the Sami. The Old Norse literature is filled with references to individuals who had learned this power from the Finna, and invariably, these references carry undertones of both awe and moral ambiguity. For the Norse, power gained through cider was effective, but spiritually dangerous, useful, but somehow unmanly, potent, but carrying prices that extended far beyond the immediate material cost. Imagine a typical trading encounter of this period. A group of Norse merchants, perhaps following in Otter's wake, beaches their vessel on some remote shore and makes contact with a Sami band. The Norse have brought iron goods, knives, spear points, perhaps some silver arm rings, items of undeniable practical value in this harsh environment. But what they seek in return goes far beyond the furs, amber, and walrus ivory that form the conventional trade goods of the northern routes. They have come seeking something far more intangible and infinitely more valuable, knowledge. Specifically, they seek the services of individuals who can manipulate weather patterns, who can divine the location of game animals or schools of fish, who can ensure favorable winds for sailing or bring storms down upon enemies. These are not requests that can be fulfilled through conventional craftsmanship or even exceptional skill. They require access to forces that the Norse, for all their prowess in battle and seamanship, cannot command. The negotiations for such services follow patterns unlike anything in the Norse experience. There are no oaths sworn on ring or sword, no formal exchanges of hostages to guarantee good faith. Instead, there are complex rituals of approach, gifts presented not as payment, but as offerings to the spirits that govern the transaction, and careful observances designed to maintain the delicate balance between the visible and invisible worlds that make such cooperation possible. The archaeological record from sites along the northern trade routes tells part of this story through the material evidence left behind. Excavations at locations like Korpang in southern Norway have revealed Sami artifacts, decorated combs made from antler, silver ornaments worked in distinctive northern styles, and most tellingly, fragments of drums and other ritual objects that speak to the presence of Noadi among the traders who frequented these markets. But it is in the darker corners of the saga literature that we find the most revealing glimpses of how deeply the reputation of the Sami had penetrated Norse consciousness. The saga of the Volsungs contains references to the use of Sami magic in warfare, describing how certain warriors sought out Finnish shamans before important battles, seeking rituals that would bring victory or protection from enemy weapons. These references are always accompanied by a sense of moral unease. The power is real and effective, but it comes at costs that extend far beyond the material realm. One particularly striking account comes from the Egil saga, where the Skald Egil Skallagrimsson encounters what appears to be a Sami practitioner who has been hired to curse him and his companions. The description of this encounter reads like something from a much later horror story. The practitioner performs rituals involving carved runes, speaks incantations in a language that sounds unlike human speech, and creates effects that seem to bend the very fabric of reality. Egil, himself no stranger to the practice of runic magic, recognizes the power being wielded against him and responds with counter-rituals of his own, but the saga makes clear that he considers the Finna magic to be far more potent than anything in his own arsenal. These stories reveal something crucial about the nature of the fear that the Sami inspired among the Norse. It was not the straightforward terror that comes from facing superior numbers or better weapons. It was something far more unsettling, the fear of confronting power that operates according to completely different rules. The Vikings had built their reputation on their ability to project force more effectively than their enemies, to appear suddenly where they were least expected, and to strike with overwhelming violence before disappearing again into the vastness of sea or forest. But the Sami represented a different kind of threat entirely. They did not need to appear suddenly, because they were already present in ways that could not be detected by conventional means. They did not need to strike with overwhelming violence, because they could accomplish their goals through methods that left no physical trace. And they did not need to disappear after their work was done, because they had never been visible in the first place. The accounts that filtered back from these northern encounters began to take on an increasingly supernatural cast, as they were retold around the fires of Norse halls during the long winter nights. Stories spoke of Sami, who could transform themselves into wolves or bears, who could travel vast distances in the span of a heartbeat, who could see events unfolding in distant places, and who could bring death to enemies without ever coming within sword's reach. Whether these accounts represented literal truth or the inevitable distortion that comes from fear and incomprehension matters less than their effect on Norse consciousness. The mere possibility that such powers existed, that there were people in the world who could wield forces beyond the reach of conventional warfare, introduced an element of uncertainty into the Norse worldview that was deeply unsettling to a culture built on the assumption that courage and strength of arm could overcome any obstacle. As these stories spread throughout the Norse world, they began to influence behavior in ways that extended far beyond the immediate northern territories where actual contact with the Sami occurred. Norse jarls began to seek out individuals who claimed knowledge of Finna magic. Traders who had spent time in the north found themselves courted by chieftains who hoped to learn the secrets of weatherworking or enemy cursing. And gradually, the practices associated with the Sami began to infiltrate Norse culture itself, creating hybrid traditions that combined Norse runic knowledge with techniques and perspectives borrowed from the indigenous peoples of the far north. This cultural exchange was not without its complications. The Norse, particularly after the advent of Christianity, found themselves deeply ambivalent about powers that seemed to operate outside the approved channels of divine intervention. The effectiveness of Sami magic could not be denied, but its spiritual implications were troubling to a people increasingly concerned with the salvation of their souls. Yet the attraction remained irresistible for a culture that prized power above almost all other values. The abilities attributed to the Sami represented the ultimate form of strength power that could not be countered by courage, skill, or superior numbers. It was, quite literally, power that operated beyond the normal rules of engagement, and for warriors who had spent their lives learning to master those conventional rules, the implications were both fascinating and terrifying. Deep beneath the modern city of Tromsø, in a climate-controlled chamber that maintains the precise temperature and humidity necessary to preserve artifacts that have survived for over 1,000 years, sits an object that would have struck terror into the heart of any medieval Viking who encountered it in its original context. It is a drum, not the simple percussion instrument that the word might bring to mind, but something far more complex and spiritually charged, a runnibum, one of the sacred drums that served as the primary tool of Sami Naoedi, the shamans whose reputation for supernatural power spread far beyond the boundaries of their Arctic homeland. The drum itself appears deceptively simple at first glance. Its frame, carved from birchwood that grew in forests where the midnight sun never sets, forms an oval approximately 2 feet in length. Over this frame, reindeer hide has been stretched taut, creating a resonant surface that, when struck with the proper bone or antler drumstick, produces sounds that range from deep, earth-shaking rumbles to high, piercing notes that seem to cut through the very fabric of reality itself. But it is not the drum's construction that would have unsettled medieval observers. It is the intricate symbols painted across its surface in pigments derived from ochre, charcoal, and other substances gathered from the sacred places of the northern landscape. These are not mere decorative elements, but comprise a complex cosmological map, a visual representation of the Sami understanding of the universe and the pathways that connect the world of everyday experience with the realms inhabited by spirits, ancestors, and otherworldly beings. Imagine running your fingers across the surface of such a drum, feeling the slight roughness of the reindeer hide and the raised texture where the painted symbols catch the light from the flickering flames of oil lamps. Each marking serves as both destination and roadmap for the Noedi spiritual journeys. Here, near the center, are symbols representing the axis mundi, the cosmic tree or pillar that connects the upper world of sky spirits with the middle world of human habitation and the lower world of the dead, and the powers that govern the deep places of the earth. Radiating outward from this central axis are pathways marked by symbols that an untrained eye might mistake for simple drawings of animals, human figures, and natural features. But to the Noedi who created and used this drum, each symbol represents a specific spiritual entity, a particular location in the otherworld, or a type of power that can be called upon for a healing, divination, or protection. The reindeer figures speak not merely of the animals, so central to Sami survival, but of spirit guides who can carry the shaman's consciousness across vast distances in the space of a heartbeat. The human figures represent ancestors, spirits, and otherworldly beings whose cooperation is essential for the successful completion of spiritual work. Archaeological investigations at sites throughout Sápmi, the traditional homeland of the Sami people, stretching across northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and into Russia, have revealed the material foundation that supported this sophisticated spiritual practice. Excavations at locations like the Sami settlement at Levenluta in Finland have uncovered not only the drums themselves, but the entire toolkit of shamanistic practice, carved antler amulets depicting bears, wolves, and other power animals. Bronze and silver ornaments worked with symbols that echo those found on the drums. And most intriguingly, small metal objects that appear to represent the Arpa's miniature figures that were placed on the drum surface during divination rituals. These Arpas deserve particular attention, for they provide crucial insight into how the drum was actually used in practice. During a divination session, the Noedi would place one or more of these small metal or bone figures on the drum surface, and then begin to beat a specific rhythm. As the drumming continued and the Noedi entered into a trance state, the vibrations would cause the Arpits to move across the drum surface, their final positions relative to the painted symbols providing the answers to whatever questions had been posed. To an outsider witnessing such a ritual, the effect would have been profoundly unsettling. The steady rhythm of the drum, often maintained 4 hours at a time, creates a hypnotic effect that can induce altered states of consciousness even in passive observers. Combined with the flickering light of the ritual fire and the chanting that typically accompanies the drumming, the entire experience would have seemed to transport participants into a reality governed by laws entirely different from those of the everyday world. But the drums represent only one element of the complex system of beliefs and practices that gave the Sami their reputation for supernatural power. Archaeological evidence from across Sápmi reveals a material culture deeply intertwined with spiritual practice. Excavations at the Sami site of Anarsaiva in northern Sweden have revealed caches of bear teeth and claws, carefully preserved and modified for use as amulets. The bear, revered throughout circumpolar cultures as a creature that moves between worlds, hibernating in the earth like the dead, but returning to life with the spring, held particular significance in Sami spirituality. The process of obtaining these bear amulets provides insight into another aspect of Sami practice that would have seemed supernatural to outsiders: their apparent ability to predict and control the movements of wild animals. The Sami understanding of bear behavior were so sophisticated that they could predict with remarkable accuracy when and where bears would emerge from hibernation, when they would be most likely to encounter humans, and how they would react to various forms of human approach. This knowledge was not gained through casual observation, but through generations of careful study, combined with spiritual practices that included ritual dreaming, trance-state communication with animal spirits, and complex ceremonies designed to maintain proper relationships with the bear spirits that govern the success of hunting. To an outsider, the Sami ability to locate bears, predict their behavior, and occasionally appear to communicate with them directly would have seemed like clear evidence of supernatural power. Similar sophisticated knowledge systems governed Sami interactions with reindeer, fish, birds, and other animals crucial to northern survival. The astronomical precision with which they could predict the movements of reindeer herds, the locations where fish would congregate at specific times of year, and the weather patterns that would affect all aspects of life in the Arctic stem from knowledge systems that integrated practical observation with spiritual practice in ways that were impossible for outsiders to fully comprehend. Consider, for instance, the Sami practice of wind working, the ability that Norse sources most frequently attributed to Finna magic. Archaeological evidence suggests that this practice was based on an extremely sophisticated understanding of Arctic weather patterns combined with ritual techniques for timing important activities to coincide with favorable conditions. Excavations at high-altitude sites used for weather observation have revealed stone arrangements that served as both practical instruments for measuring wind direction and sacred spaces where rituals were performed to ensure favorable weather for hunting, fishing, or travel. The process of becoming a Noadi provides perhaps the clearest insight into how these seemingly supernatural abilities were actually developed and maintained. Training began in childhood with the identification of individuals who showed particular sensitivity to the spiritual dimensions of existence. Children who reported dreams or visions that later proved prophetically accurate, who demonstrated unusual empathy with animals, or who showed signs of what modern psychology recognizes as heightened intuitive abilities. These chosen children underwent years of intensive training that combined practical education in survival skills with spiritual instruction in the use of drums, the interpretation of omens, and the performance of rituals. Perhaps most importantly, they learned to enter and maintain the altered states of consciousness that were essential for effective shamanic work. This training often involved prolonged periods of isolation in the wilderness, fasting, exposure to extreme temperatures, and other techniques for inducing the kind of heightened awareness that made possible the seemingly impossible feats attributed to accomplished Noadi. The material evidence from Sami sacred sites reveals the sophisticated nature of these training practices. At Sidi stones, naturally occurring rock formations that served as focus points for spiritual activity, archaeologists have found deposits of offerings that span centuries of continuous use. The variety and careful placement of these offerings suggest ritual practices of considerable complexity, requiring extensive knowledge of proper procedures, appropriate materials, and correct timing. But perhaps the most convincing evidence for the reality behind the Sami reputation for supernatural power comes from the detailed accounts left by outside observers who witnessed Noadi at work. The most famous of these is the account left by Johannes Shefrus in his 1673 work Laponia. Based on extensive interviews with individuals who had personal experience of Sami shamanistic practices, Shefrus describes rituals in which Noadi appeared to travel in spirit to distant locations, returning with accurate information about events occurring hundreds of miles away. He records instances of weather prediction with accuracy that seemed impossible given the technology of the time, and healing practices that achieved results that conventional medicine could not explain. While Shefrus wrote from a Christian perspective that was deeply suspicious of such practices, his accounts are notable for their detailed, matter-of-fact descriptions of phenomena that he clearly witnessed but could not explain through the worldview of his own culture. These accounts gain additional credibility when compared with similar phenomena recorded in other circumpolar cultures. The Inuit Angkokuit of Greenland, the Evenk shamans of Siberia, and the indigenous practitioners of northern Alaska all developed remarkably similar techniques for altered state consciousness work, weather prediction, long-distance communication, and healing practices. The consistency of these traditions across vast geographic distances and distinct cultural groups suggests that the abilities attributed to the Sami Noadi were not merely the products of fearful imagination, but represented genuine techniques that produced real, observable results. The decline of these traditional practices began with the systematic Christianization campaigns of the 17th and 18th centuries, during which thousands of sacred drums were confiscated and destroyed by religious authorities who recognized them as repositories of non-Christian spiritual power. The few drums that survive in museums today represent only a tiny fraction of a tradition that once encompassed hundreds, perhaps thousands, of active practitioners across the Arctic regions of Scandinavia and Russia. Yet even as the formal practice of Sami shamanism was suppressed, its influence on the surrounding cultures continued to be felt. The Norse practice of cider, which incorporated numerous elements borrowed from Sami tradition, persisted well into the Christian period. Folk traditions throughout Scandinavia retained elements of weather working, animal communication, and spirit contact that clearly derived from contact with indigenous shamanic practices. And the reputation of the Lapps for supernatural power continued to influence European consciousness well into the modern period, appearing in folk tales, historical accounts, and even scientific treatises that attempted to explain the seemingly impossible abilities attributed to these northern peoples. The archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that the supernatural powers of the Sami represented a sophisticated integration of practical knowledge with ritual techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness. Their ability to predict weather, locate game, communicate over long distances, and influence the behavior of others was based on real techniques that produced observable results. Even if those techniques operated according to principles that conventional medieval European culture could not understand or explain. For the Vikings, encountering people who possessed such capabilities would have been profoundly unsettling, not because the abilities themselves were necessarily incomprehensible, but because they represented forms of power that could not be countered through conventional warfare. A warrior might face superior numbers, better weapons, or more advantageous terrain with confidence in his ability to overcome such challenges through skill and courage. But how does one fight an enemy who can call storms, who knows your movements before you make them, and who can strike at you from distances that make conventional retaliation impossible? This, ultimately, was the source of the terror that the Sami inspired among even the fiercest Viking warriors, not the fear of the unknown, but the far more unsettling recognition that they faced adversaries who fought according to rules that rendered conventional notions of strength and courage irrelevant. In the great hall of a Norse chieftain, perhaps somewhere along the fjords of western Norway, the evening fire casts dancing shadows on walls hung with weapons that tell the story of a warrior culture at its zenith. Swords gleam with the distinctive pattern welding that marks them as masterworks of the smith's art, their hilts worn smooth by the grip of hands that have wielded them in battles from Ireland to the gates of Constantinople. Shields bear the scars of combat, their painted surfaces telling stories of raids successful and honor won through strength of arm and boldness of spirit. The men who gather around such fires represent the apex of medieval martial culture warriors, whose reputation has spread terror across the known world, whose longships have carried them to shores that other Europeans barely dare to imagine. These are men who have faced the disciplined ranks of Frankish heavy cavalry without flinching, who have stormed the walls of fortified monasteries defended by desperate monks, who have sailed through storms that would have destroyed lesser vessels and crews. They measure their worth in silver armorings won through battle, in the number of ships they can command, in the fear their names inspire among their enemies. Yet, when the conversation turns to the peoples of the far north, to the Finna who dwell beyond the edge of the world they know, these same warriors speak in tones touched with something that approaches awe. For here, in their discussions of the Sami, they encounter a form of power that operates according to principles entirely foreign to their understanding of how strength and influence function in the world. Consider the fundamental differences in how these two cultures approach the acquisition and exercise of power. For the Vikings, power was something seized through direct action, raids launched with overwhelming force, territories conquered through superior tactics, wealth accumulated through successful plunder or advantageous trade. Their social structure reflected this emphasis on martial prowess. Jarls commanded through their ability to lead successful raids, carls earned respect through their skill with weapons, and even thralls could potentially improve their status through demonstrations of courage or useful abilities. The physical symbols of Norse power reflected this martial orientation. A successful Viking leader's wealth was displayed in the form of weapons, ships, and precious metals, objects that could be touched, counted, and displayed as proof of achievement. The great halls, where such leaders held court, were designed to showcase their military success. High-roofed spaces that could accommodate large numbers of armed followers, their walls decorated with the spoils of successful raids, their benches arranged to reflect the careful hierarchies of a warrior society. Contrast this with the source of authority within Sami society, where power derived not from the ability to project force, but from knowledge of the invisible currents that govern existence in the Arctic wilderness. A Noadi earned respect not through victories in battle, but through demonstrated ability to navigate the complex relationships between the human and spirit worlds. The tools of such power were not swords and shields, but drums painted with cosmological maps, amulets carved with symbols that connected their bearers to protective spirits, and the accumulated wisdom of generations of spiritual practitioners. The spaces where Sami power was exercised differed dramatically from the Norse mead halls, with their emphasis on display and hierarchy. Sacred sites often consisted of nothing more than naturally occurring rock formations or groves of trees that had been designated as points of connection between worlds. The power concentrated in such places was invisible to casual observation. No gold or silver marked them as valuable. No weapons proclaimed their importance. Yet for those who understood their significance, these sites represented repositories of spiritual force that could influence events across vast distances and affect the lives of people who had never seen them. The daily routines through which these different forms of power were maintained and exercised reveal perhaps the starkest contrasts between the two cultures. A Norse Jarl might begin his day by reviewing the weapons and armor of his followers, planning raids or trade expeditions, receiving reports from scouts about the movements of enemies or opportunities for profitable ventures. His concerns centered on matters that could be directly observed and influenced through conventional means: the loyalty of his men, the seaworthiness of his vessels, the adequacy of his supplies for whatever military or commercial enterprise he planned to undertake. The daily routine of a Sami Noadi followed entirely different patterns. The morning might begin with dream interpretation, analyzing the visions that had come during the night for information about weather patterns, animal movements, or spiritual developments that could affect the community's welfare. Time would be spent in consultation with the drum, seeking guidance about the timing of important decisions or the proper ritual approaches to upcoming challenges. Offerings would be made at appropriate sites, not as displays of wealth, but as necessary maintenance of the relationships with spiritual entities whose cooperation was essential for community survival. These different approaches to power created corresponding differences in what each culture feared from its adversaries. The Vikings understood their enemies in terms of conventional military threats: superior numbers, better weapons, more advantageous positions, or the possibility of betrayal by supposed allies. Their defensive strategies focused on countering such tangible dangers through improved tactics, stronger fortifications, more extensive intelligence networks, or the cultivation of more powerful allies. But how does one defend against enemies whose weapons are invisible and whose attacks follow no conventional rules of engagement? The Sami reputation for supernatural power presented the Vikings with challenges that their traditional military culture was fundamentally unprepared to address. Stories filtered down from the northern territories spoke of warriors who had sickened and died without any visible cause after offending Finnish omens, of expeditions that had been destroyed by storms that seemed to arise from clear skies, of battles lost because the enemy had somehow known every tactical move in advance. The Norse response to these challenges reveals the profound discomfort that the Sami inspired within Viking culture. Rather than attempting to confront such powers directly through conventional military means, many Norse leaders instead sought to co-opt them, hiring Sami practitioners to work on their behalf or attempting to learn the techniques of weatherworking and enemy cursing for themselves. This represented a fundamental shift in Norse thinking and acknowledgement that there were forms of power that could not be seized through conquest, but had to be approached through negotiation, payment, and careful observance of protocols that operated according to entirely foreign principles. The social implications of this shift were profound and troubling for a culture built on the assumption that courage and martial skill could overcome any obstacle. The Norse concept of honor was intimately connected to the idea of facing danger directly, of meeting challenges through open combat rather than through subterfuge or supernatural intervention. Yet the effectiveness of Sami spiritual practices could not be denied, creating a tension between cultural values and practical necessity that was never fully resolved. This tension is perhaps most clearly visible in the Norse treatment of cider, the magical practices that incorporated many elements borrowed from Sami tradition. While cider was recognized as effective, it was also considered somewhat dishonorable, particularly for men. The Eddic poem Lokasenna contains Odin's admission that he has practiced cider, but this confession is presented as shameful, something that diminishes rather than enhances his heroic status. The implication is clear: power gained through such means, however effective, carries with it a spiritual cost that compromises the practitioner's honor and social standing. The economic systems that supported these different forms of power reveal another fundamental contrast between the two cultures. Viking society was built on the assumption that wealth could be accumulated through successful raids and trade, that material prosperity was limited only by one's courage and skill in seizing opportunities. The great trading centers that developed along Viking routes, places like Birka, Hidibi, and Korpang, reflected this understanding, serving as nodes where the wealth extracted from across the known world could be concentrated and redistributed according to the hierarchies of warrior society. Sami society operated according to entirely different economic principles. Wealth, in the conventional sense of accumulated material goods, was far less important than maintaining proper relationships with the spiritual forces that govern survival in the Arctic environment. A successful Noadi might possess very few material goods, by Norse standards perhaps a drum, some ritual clothing, a collection of amulets, and other sacred objects, but their true wealth lay in their knowledge and their ability to access powers that no amount of gold or silver could purchase. The educational systems through which these different forms of power were transmitted reveal equally stark contrasts. Young Norsemen learn their craft through direct participation in raids and battles, gradually acquiring the skills and reputation necessary for leadership through demonstrated prowess in combat and successful accumulation of wealth. The path to power was, in theory at least, open to anyone with sufficient courage and ability. A thrall who distinguished himself in battle might eventually rise to become a respected warrior, and a successful warrior might accumulate enough wealth and followers to establish himself as a jarl. The training of a Sami Noadi followed entirely different patterns. The spiritual abilities necessary for effective shamanic practice could not be acquired simply through courage and determination. They required particular kinds of sensitivity that were often recognized in childhood and developed through years of carefully structured training. The knowledge transmitted in this process could not be seized through conquest or purchased with conventional wealth. It had to be earned through demonstrated spiritual aptitude and painstaking apprenticeship to established practitioners. Perhaps most significantly, the two cultures differed fundamentally in their understanding of the relationship between human agency and the forces that governed existence. Viking culture emphasized the ability of determined individuals to shape their own destiny through bold action: the hero who seizes his chance for glory, the explorer who discovers new lands, the warrior who wins wealth and honor through strength of arm. Even their gods reflected this emphasis on action and individual achievement, with Odin as the wanderer who seeks knowledge and power through his own efforts, Thor as the warrior who protects Asgard through his mighty hammer, and the various heroes of the sagas who achieve immortality through their deeds. Sami culture operated according to a fundamentally different understanding of human agency. While individual skill and knowledge were certainly valued, they were always understood within the context of a larger web of relationships that included not only other humans, but the spirits of animals, ancestors, and the various invisible entities that inhabited the Arctic landscape. Success in any endeavor depended not merely on human effort, but on maintaining proper relationships with these spiritual forces through appropriate ritual observances, correct behavior, and careful attention to the signs and omens that revealed their will. This difference in worldview created corresponding differences in how each culture approached crisis and adversity. When Vikings faced challenges, their instinctive response was to seek solutions through more effective action, better weapons, superior tactics, stronger allies, or more daring raids that would provide the resources necessary to overcome whatever obstacles they faced. Their heroes were individuals who refused to accept defeat, who found ways to triumph through cleverness, courage, or sheer determination. When the Sami faced crises, their first response was typically to seek understanding of the spiritual dimensions of their situation. What relationships had been damaged? What obligations had been neglected? What spiritual forces needed to be propitiated before practical solutions could be effectively implemented? The resolution of problems often required not just practical action, but ritual work designed to restore the proper balance between the human community and the invisible powers that ultimately governed all existence. These fundamental differences in approach to power, authority, and the nature of effective action help explain why the encounter between Vikings and Sami proved so profoundly unsettling to Norse consciousness. The Vikings were accustomed to enemies. They could understand in terms of their own cultural framework other warriors who fought with weapons they recognized, using tactics they could counter, for goals they could comprehend. But the Sami represented something entirely different: adversaries who wielded forms of power that operated according to principles the Norse could neither fully understand nor effectively counter through conventional means. The result was a kind of cognitive dissonance that reverberates through the Norse literary record. The sagas are filled with references to the effectiveness of Finna magic, but these references are almost always accompanied by a sense of moral ambivalence, as if the very acknowledgement of such power somehow compromised the heroic values that formed the foundation of Norse identity. In the end, the terror that the Sami inspired among the Vikings was not simply the fear of superior force, it was the far more profound anxiety that comes from encountering a form of power that renders one's own understanding of strength and courage irrelevant. For a culture that had built its identity on the assumption that bold action could overcome any obstacle, the existence of adversaries who fought according to entirely different rules represented a challenge that could never be fully resolved through conventional military means. This recognition would ultimately contribute to changes in Norse culture itself, as elements of Sami spiritual practice gradually infiltrated Nordic tradition through the complex processes of cultural exchange that characterize all frontier societies. But that is perhaps a story for another evening, when we might explore how the encounter with the peoples of the far north ultimately helped reshape the very foundations of Scandinavian civilization. As we draw our journey through these northern mists to its gentle close, perhaps you find yourself settling more deeply into the comfort of your present surroundings, warm, safe, far removed from the harsh uncertainties that governed life in those distant centuries when the aurora danced above struggles between different understandings of what it meant to possess power in the world. The story of the forgotten tribe that could terrify the Vikings speaks to something deeper than the simple clash between different military traditions or the inevitable friction that arises when cultures meet along the edges of the known world. It reminds us that throughout history, the most profound forms of power have often been those that operate beyond the reach of conventional understanding, that draw their strength not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to navigate the invisible currents that connect all things in ways that purely material approaches to existence can never fully comprehend. The Vikings, for all their martial prowess and their ability to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies across continents, found themselves humbled by people who wielded weapons forged not in smithies, but in the deep places of the spirit, who commanded forces that could not be countered by superior swords or more numerous longships. The Sami Nawadi, sitting by their ritual fires in the endless Arctic night, possessed something that all the wealth of successful raids could not purchase: an understanding of how to work with powers that existed beyond the boundaries of the visible world. In our modern age, surrounded by technologies that would seem magical to both Vikings and Sami alike, we might find it easy to dismiss such stories as merely the products of superstition and ignorance. Yet perhaps there is wisdom in remembering that every generation believes it has finally mapped the full extent of reality, only to have that certainty challenged by the next wave of discovery and understanding. The drums are silent now in the museums, where they rest behind climate-controlled glass, their painted symbols faded, but still speaking to those who know how to read the languages of symbol and metaphor. The sacred sites where offerings were made for countless generations stand empty of all but tourists and archaeologists. The knowledge that once allowed individuals to navigate between worlds has largely vanished with the people who carried it, yet something of that power lingers still in the stories, in the archaeological record, in the folk memories that persist even in our rationalized modern world. It lingers in the reminder that there are forms of strength that do not announce themselves with the clash of weapons, forms of courage that express themselves not through bold action, but through patient attention to the subtle signs that reveal the deeper patterns governing existence. As you close your eyes tonight, surrounded by the familiar comforts of the modern world, perhaps you might spare a thought for those long-ago encounters in the northern wilderness, where people who measured power in entirely different ways met and recognized in each other something that could neither be conquered nor dismissed. In that recognition, in that moment of cultural contact that left both sides changed, we catch a glimpse of the endlessly complex ways in which human societies have learned to adapt to worlds that are always larger and more mysterious than any single understanding can fully encompass. The Vikings returned to their halls with stories that would echo through the centuries, tales of a people who commanded forces beyond the reach of sword and shield. The Sami continued their ancient practices, their drums beating rhythms that connected earth and sky, visible and invisible, until the changing world made such connections increasingly difficult to maintain. But in the space between those two worlds, in the moment of encounter between different understandings of what it meant to be human in a universe full of powers, both seen and unseen, something important was preserved: a reminder that the boundaries we draw around possibility are often far narrower than the actual extent of what exists beyond our current comprehension. Sleep well, knowing that you rest in a world where the greatest terrors of those ancient times have long since faded into history, where the clash between different forms of power has resolved into the gentler rhythms of memory and story. Let the aurora dance in your dreams, carrying with it the whispers of those who once knew how to read the invisible currents that connect all things, and who remind us still that there are mysteries in the world that remain, even now, beyond the reach of conventional understanding.